During the recession of the early 80s, employment was hard to find. I was a maintenance man with a great work ethic due to my military background, but most employers turned me away. I didn't have an engineering degree, though I was better than most who built things for a living. One day I went to a bar on the Nevada side. Believe it or not, that was how people networked in those days when they wanted to find a source of income. I was already living out of a van. I survived on PB&J sandwiches and ramen noodles. I walked into that tap house and struck up a conversation with a man named Gillen. He had sat next to me. He was well dressed in a pressed suit and almost seemed out of place in such a dive. The dust mites in the rays of sunlight settled on the counter between us as he sipped his highball. "You look like a biker from an action movie," he said. "I'm a handyman searching for a job," I said. "If you know anyone hiring, I'd love to interview." "What can you do?" I asked. I didn't want to brag, but I responded in full by notifying him there was little I was incapable of. I could perform cleaning, light repairs, landscaping, carpentry, and fix appliances. "A wrench is a natural extension of my body," I said. "I'm installing a fence around my property," he said, as he finished a gin and tonic. "The contractors I've talked to want to destroy my wallet. Do you think we could work something out? I'd rather give money to a stand-up guy like you than some of these con artists claiming to be something they're not." "Yes," I said. I proceeded to ask him how many feet of wire he needed. I told him off the top of my head how much the cost would be, when he responded it would be thousands of pounds worth. I reasoned his estate must be massive. He also emphasised that he wanted barbed wire. I should have found that detail alarming, but didn't think much of it in the moment. "When can I look at the place?" I asked. "Tonight," he said, as he shoved the tumbler towards the server. "Hell, right now." We went out to the parking lot. An Audi was awaiting us, the headlights already turned on. A man in a suit sat behind the wheel. I couldn't fathom having a chauffeur. "What do you do for a living?" I said, after we settled in the back seat. I couldn't hide my curiosity anymore. "I'm a biologist," he said. "Not at a stuffy university either. I operate my own lab. We do important research." "How far away is your place?" "Only a few miles." "Something you should know. There's an entire wing of my property under renovation. It would make me happy if your services are available to work on it as well." "How long do you plan on staying here?" "Till I die if you pay me well enough," I said. He laughed at that as we approached the manor. The gates opened. We followed a winding concrete pathway, surrounded by a dewy green grass. Their blades glistened in the moonlight. He walked me up to the top level and patted me on the back. "If you give me your car keys," he said, "I can have my driver go to your vehicle and collect your tools. The construction zone is yours to stay in if you think you can be comfortable there." I had told him earlier that I was new to town. I did not expect him to be so welcoming. I had to keep in mind he was still intoxicated, and I thought I should take his kindness for granted. It wasn't a daily opportunity to stay in such a luxurious place after all. It would be the most torn apart section of it, but I had to take it. "I'd be grateful for that," I said as I handed him my key. "Please have him bring my backpack as well. There's a sleeping bag and paperback novel in there." He gave it to his employee, and within half an hour, I found a corner to shack up in. He did not know that he had, within 5 hours of meeting me, welcomed a criminal into his house. Granted, I wasn't an evil one. I liked to think of myself as having a better moral compass than the average lawbreaker. I robbed a bank in Paso Robles after my wife got sick. Not only did a few witnesses give the authorities my description, I was behind bars when she passed away. That wasn't for him to know, though. I knew that if I told him, he'd assume I was a malicious and unrepentant thief. Best to keep it quiet. I curled up underneath my blanket. Sawdust surrounded me, and a breeze came over the Sierra Nevada mountains in the distance. The room I was in was a work in progress, since there were no walls, only beams and rows of grimy floorboards. The level looked out at the gardens and the park next to the house. I was grateful to not to have to sleep in the cramped space of my Ford. I had one goal. I had to show him I was valuable, and he would let me stay here until the projects were complete. I awoke around midnight, parched from the few beers I had drank at the establishment earlier. I walked near the stairs to head to the kitchen, and a verdant luminescence caught my eye. I looked down at the forested pastures. 2 men sat across from each other over some kind of board game. The board, which I presumed to be chess, glowed a neon green between them. One of them turned and peered up at me. The gaunt look he possessed made a shadow appear around his eyes, and I could not make out their colour. I turned around and tried to go back to sleep. The next night, a bout of insomnia overcame me. I had spent the day hanging drywall after hours of fastening bottom and top plates. How tiredness had not gotten to me was a mystery. I tried every trick I knew to get back into a slumber. I tried breathing techniques and meditations from psychology books I found in prison. Nothing seemed to work. I tried to get lost in my paperback, a collection by Richard Matheson, and all it did was captivate me. I looked out to see if those men would be there, continuing their competitive match. I didn't understand the hours they kept, and a part of me wondered if they were casing the area to burglarise it. If my negative suspicions were true, that had to be the strangest front ever put up by a potential home invader. As I scanned the wilderness, what I saw next stunned me. 2 women sat down next to each other in a thicket of trees. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-30s. Their faces were visible, but they wore yellow hazmat suits. I crawled to the edge of the flooring to get a better view of them. Their choice of clothing concerned me. That was when a man leapt out from behind of one of the pines and chased after them. Even from my vantage point, he was huge, very lanky and towering. My instincts kicked in. I went downstairs and ran into the woodland in pursuit to help. This was a foolish manoeuvre from the standpoint of self-preservation, but I had to. Leaves crunched under my feet as I made my way deeper into the outgrowth. A screwdriver and a box cutter were in my pockets. They would be the only weapons, besides my grappling, should an act of violence occur. A rabbit hopped by. It stopped to look at me before it moved behind a log. I saw a skull drawn on its fur in black marker. I observed a clearing in the distance and heard a masculine voice. I inched closer. Something crawled in the trees above me. The sound of something sharp, scraping on wood floated. Although not a religious person, I prayed it was a mountain lion. I continued to follow the chatter, and saw the same two men moving their pieces on the chessboard. One was the bully who had driven the woman away from their peaceful spot. What struck me as odd was how gigantic both individuals were. I was 5'9", but these men had to be tall enough to puncture most ceilings, at least 6'7". Both had blanched faces. I crept behind a bush and watched as one of them boasted in the victory of the match. What they wore was even stranger than the wardrobe of the women I'd seen earlier. They both had leather long coats. Wires and patches hung from their exposed chests, as though they had both escaped from a hospital. One looked in my direction. I knew the obscurity and terrain would cloak me, but him hunting for me out of pure alarm caused a memory to well up. I was in the jungle as I tossed white phosphorus smoke grenades between bamboo stalks. I hoped the bullets flying around me would not connect. I shook my head and came back to the present moment. Now was the time to remain focused. I kept low and made my way back to Gillen's house. I was unsure of what had happened to the females, but relieved to have returned to my new home. The moonlight seemed brighter when I went to rest. The light of it washed over me. I was unable to do anything but stare out at the tree line in anticipation of what else it could bring. "There's a third room I want you to work on," Gillen said as he cut into syrup-drenched French toast. We sat at his kitchen table made of marble. Maple wood cabinets surrounded us and had stainless steel handles. I had never been in such a high-end dining area. I kept expecting his wife or kids to come down and commiserate, if he had any. I had started to form the conclusion that he was without family, but I didn't want to pry. "Sure," I said. "My basement needs to be a little bit livelier. Make it modern, newer." "Like a bachelor pad?" I asked. He stared at me as his forehead crinkled. He savoured the last bite of breakfast before he put his silverware down and finished a glass of milk. As he picked up a napkin and wiped his mouth, he stared at me and placed it in the puddle of liquid sugar on his plate. "No," he said with a shake of his head. "I need it to be pleasing. Imagine if you were remodelling a room you had to stay in no matter what. A place you could not escape from unless you were willing to die. I will show it to you soon enough." I paused and nodded. He was the boss, and though his request was vague to me at the moment, I agreed. Yet I had to state what was bothering me. I wiped my forehead with a napkin before I went further. "Who owned this land before you?" I asked. "Why are you concerned about that?" "I spent some small amount of time in Dalat, Vietnam. Don't know how familiar you are with the geography over there, but it's the capital of the Lam Dong province. It's a scenic place, and the locals call it the City of Eternal Spring. There's a villa there called Pren Pass. One night I went there on a lark, disobeying a lot of direct orders to try and get away from my station. I didn't get caught. While I was there, I saw a woman fall through the window. I later found out it was a haunted domicile. A woman escaped and fell to her death to get away from a real horrible man. In other words, Mr. Gillen, ghosts exist, having seen one myself. I also think the outskirts of this place has them. I saw two men playing some kind of game, and a couple of women dressed like they were getting ready for the end of the world. Of all the responses I may have expected, laughter was not one of them, which is the exact thing he unleashed on me. Once his chuckles stopped, he stood and pointed to the other end of the area. He motioned near the living quarters where sofas and coffee tables sat. "I want to tell you what I expect out of the basement upon completion," he said. I was a bit irritated that he ignored my tale, as though he had not listened to me at all. I still followed him. Even after all these years, I still respected rank structures, often to my own detriment. He opened a door and led me down a flight of stairs. It didn't take long for me to realise it was an underground fallout shelter. The place had metal barriers. Stacked around the chamber were crates of non-perishable goods. In the centre was a metal slab with beakers, vials and microscopes. "There's something I have to confess to you," he said. "Something I have not told anyone else or even spoken about. You know your eyes are not lying to you. You're a reasonable man, no doubt." He took a seat and offered me one near the scientific setup. I obliged and tried to get comfortable, impossible as it was. "You might think that this place is to guard itself against imminent danger from the Russians," he said. "That's somewhat close to the reality, but it's not the entirety of it. In truth, this place was here before the tensions between the nations even started. This place used to belong to the government before they relinquished it and put it on sale. They did so because something tainted it. Of course, they wanted to sell it to someone who wouldn't find this room in particular to be odd. When the government owned it, this was not a residential property open to the public. It was a very private and guarded testing site." "For what?" I asked. "And what left it tainted, as you said?" "It was a laboratory for recombinant DNA testing, to aid humanity should the worst case scenario of the bombs dropping happening." He took a seat and scratched his brow. "Mr. Gillen, I know I may look stupid, but they wanted to create a species of man that could withstand blasts of nuclear power," he said. "This is where they housed and collected data on those subjects. The motive behind it was to create an indoctrinated soldier, someone who could crawl across a radioactive continent to get to the enemy, take them out as they cowered in their bunkers. You may be wondering who the victims were in the experiments. Many were volunteers. Some were the byproduct of artificial embryo twinning. Some people in the field of science fiction refer to it as cloning. I find the term pedestrian and not accordance with true scientific terminology. Other guinea pigs had labels. Enemies of the state, for example. Ones cherry-picked by the top brass in the Department of Defense. They could only kidnap, detain and ship those that would go unnoticed when they went missing. So, drug addicts, the homeless, ex-felons. He took in a long breath before he gave the next description of an undesirable. Bank robbers. Gillen lit a cigarette and seemed to revel in watching my face. "Okay," I said. "So some people got brought here against their will?" "Yes, and some tricked into coming here. Others weren't aware of their true purpose until it was too late for them. This lab specialised in long-term nuclear consequences. On those with modified genetics in almost, dare I say, superhuman ways. The two women you saw are students who thought they were here to study chemistry. The two men were test subjects who were used to determine who would get hit with radiation first. They would come up with that outcome by playing a game of chess. The loser had to walk into the sphere and take the Roentgens first. See, we were not picky in the early stages of who we tested. As time has gone on, we decided we needed people who were athletic and had training. I took out my box cutter and sliced his ear. Blood spurted out as he backed away, up and out of his seat, and fell. I ran out of the house. His driver tried to stop me at the front gate, and I punched him in the abdomen hard enough to where he doubled over. I scaled the barbed wire fence and ran for miles. It occurred to me that no one was going to believe my story. I collected my vehicle, which was still at the bar, and drove out of town. For the next several weeks, I was worried he would go to the authorities and give them my description. That didn't happen. I guessed he didn't want investigators near his premises searching for evidence. They'd find incriminating writings, notebooks and research materials. As the decades have gone by, I ponder that dreadful day. The alleged biologist and his speech made me think he was an insane person. I ruminate on whether the people I saw were either figments of my imagination or something else. Terror grips me often. What if he told me the truth in our final conversation?